Hi everyone, this is my Decomposition Lab Results by Tiffany Eisenberger. My hypothesis was that the bin with an increased amount of moisture will decompose faster. A few predictions I had going into the experiment was that moisture would speed up decomposition, food items will decompose faster, and the control bin environment will be drier than the experimental bin environment. Controls are essential in an experiment because it allows the experiment to minimize the changes in all other variables except the one being tested. A few items I chose to use as controls in my experiment are temperature, light exposure, and airflow. The temperature remained the same between both boxes at 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Both boxes were kept in my basement with low light exposure, and both lids remained on the boxes except when weighing the items and adding water to the experimental bin. I used a variety of different items to conduct my experiment, which included a banana peel, a sheet of paper towel, a leaf, a bobby pin, a piece of bread, a Starbucks straw, a toothpick, a sweet tart rope, a plastic spoon, and a Nature Valley crispy wafer bar. The increase in water was a dependent variable because it was a piece of the experiment that changed between the two environments. The decomposition rate was a dependent variable because it was directly dependent on the amount of water that the experimental environment was receiving, and it is the variable I was interested in measuring. For the experimental setup, I had 6 steps. Step 1, weighing out equal amounts of soil and place in both the control and experimental bin. Step 2, select 10 pieces of trash that are the same for both bins. Step 3, place the pieces of trash into each bin and cover with soil. Step 4, add 50 ml of water to the experimental environment. Step 5, store bins in a dark, dry area. Step 6, add 50 ml of water to the experimental bin per week. In the next 3 slides, I will cover the changes I visually noticed from week to week. In week 1, I did not see many changes between the two environments. The dirt in both boxes still seemed moist. During weeks 2 through 4, I noticed that there were more condensation developing in the experimental box compared to the control bin. Also, mold had started to form in both bins, and there were small white sprouts in the dirt in the experimental bin. By week 5, we were starting to see a downward shift in the amount of mold in both bins. Items such as the sweet tart rope, sheet of paper towel, wafer bar, and piece of bread were starting to break down in both environments. During the 6th through 9th week, items started to become more difficult to locate within the bins due to deterioration. I was also starting to notice that the control bin seemed drier than the experimental bin, and an earthly mildew smell had developed in the experimental bin. By week 10, most of the food had broke down into pieces, while items such as the bobby pin and plastic spoon remained intact. As I wrapped up my experiment, I noticed that the control bin had become considerably drier than the experimental bin, and mold was only remaining in the experimental bin. In this slide, we will take a deeper look into the data of each item. For the size of the graph, I chose to graph stats from the beginning, middle, and end of the experiment. On this graph, it shows the weight changes of each item between weeks 1, 6, and 14 in the control environment. The banana peel between weeks 1 and 6 only saw a small decrease in the size of the banana peel, but by week 14 it had dropped in weight down to 2 grams. Next is the sheet of paper towel, which started out at 0.9 grams but seemed to absorb some moisture by week 6. It was weighing in at 1.8 grams. As the experiment ended, I saw a decrease in the weight of the paper towel, and by week 14 it was down to weighing 0.5 grams, under its original weight. While I did not see any visual changes in the leaf, Or while I did see visual changes in the leaf, such as the edges curling and the stem turning brown, I did not see a weight change. There was no visual or weight changes with the bobby pin. The piece of bread started out at 6.5 grams, and by week 6, it had absorbed moisture in the bin and grew mold on its surface, which increased its weight to 13.7 grams. At the end of the experiment, the bread had started to dry out and was down to 3.8 grams. There were no visual or weight changes in the Starbucks straw. The toothpick's weight remained the same throughout the experiment as well. The sweet tart rope was the only item that fully decomposed in the control environment. It started out weighing 11.9 grams and by week 6 had dropped to 7.2 grams. At the end of the experiment, it had fully decomposed. There were no visual or weight changes with this plastic spoon. The Nature Valley Crispy Wafer Bar started out weighing 21.8 grams. As the weeks progressed, the wafer developed mold and absorbed moisture, and its weight rose to 26.3 grams by week 6. But as the experiment progressed and the environment it was in became more dry, the weight started to decrease. By week 14, the wafer weighed 10.2 grams and was very deteriorated. Similar to the previous slide, I chose to graph the stats from the beginning, middle, and end of the experiment. On this graph, it shows the weight changes of each item between weeks 1, 6, and 14 in the experimental environment. The banana peel started out the experiment weighing 6.5 grams. By week 6, it had turned completely black and its weight dropped to 4.6 grams. At the end of the experiment, it was down to 2.2 grams. The sheet of paper towel saw a large rise in weight from weeks 1 to 6, but as the experiment went on, the towel started to lose mass, which resulted in the paper towel ending up weighing the same as it did when the experiment began. But the size of the paper towel overall was much smaller because of the moisture, it still weighed the same as it had originally. Similar to the control bin, while I did see visual changes with the leaves, such as the edges curling and stem turning brown, I did not see any weight change. There were no visual or weight changes with the bobby pin. The piece of bread started out weighing 7.7 grams, but by week 6, it had absorbed moisture and was being added to the bin and grew mold on its surface, which increased its weight to 17.4 grams. At the end of the experiment, while the bread was still damp, its weight had started to decrease due to deterioration, down to 6.7 grams. There were no visual or weight changes with the Starbucks straw. There were no weight changes with the toothpick, but it had become damp and dirty. The sweet tart rope was the only item that fully decomposed in the experimental environment. It started out weighing 11.9 grams, and by week 6, it had dropped to 8.9 grams. At the end of the experiment, it had fully decomposed. There were no visual changes or weight changes with the plastic spoon. The Nature Valley Crispy Wafer Bar started out weighing 19.8 grams. As the weeks progressed, the wafer bar developed mold, absorbed moisture, and its weight rose to 33.5 grams. But as the experiment progressed and the environment it was in, the weight started to decrease, and by the week 14, the wafer weighed 15.5 grams and was very deteriorated. The main conclusion that I was able to draw from my experiment is that there was not a correlation between the increase in moisture and decomposition. I actually noticed that items in the control bin seemed to decompose faster once the moisture level decreased. My experiment did not support my hypothesis. Both bins decomposed at similar rates, and the control bin saw items decompose quicker as the environment became more dry. The main error that occurred during my experiment was that during 1 week, I forgot to document the changes in weight of the trash items in each bin. By missing out on this data, it breaks the chain of knowing how quickly items were decreasing or increasing in weight. For me, this experiment reinforced the idea that we need to improve and increase our recycling procedures in the United States, because the items in my experiment that saw little to no changes at all were often pieces of material such as plastic and metal. These items take hundreds of years to decompose, so alternatives are essential to get rid of this type of waste. Thank you for watching.